Tonight, rocky road. The Andrews government kills off the East-West link, but the taxpayer foots the multi-million-dollar bill.
It terminates the project and it terminates the relationship between the government and the East-West consortium.
But first, the Andrews government's $420 million deal to kill off East-West Link. The controversial agreement has come under fire, critics describing it as obscene and short-sighted. But the Premier is blaming the previous government. More from state political reporter Leah Craven.
It's been Daniel Andrews' biggest headache, but after months of tense negotiations, the fate of the East-West Link has been sealed. He says it's dead and buried.
No compensation, none whatsoever. And the only monies that will be retained by the consortium are the monies that they have already spent.
The government's agreed to pay the consortium of companies contracted to build it $339 million. The government will also purchase the East-West Link project company for $1 and acquire its assets. A further $81 million in fees will be absorbed by the government, then reallocated to help fund the Melbourne Metro Rail link. More than $100 million held in cash by the consortium, which hasn't been spent, will be refunded.
Daniel Andrews was elected with a solemn commitment to Victoria not to pay a cent to get out of building this much-needed piece of infrastructure. He has broken that pledge today.
After finally releasing the contract, the Premier says he's been vindicated, that it's not worth the paper it's written on.
Not one word in the contract, not one line in the contract, no element of the contract has been used to reach this in-principle good faith agreement.
The consortium's calling it a satisfactory resolution and says its members look forward to pursuing future projects in Victoria. But question time erupted.
The real cost of this reckless political decision, at least $800 to $900 million to the Victorian taxpayer.
Order. Wrong. Order.
Allegations of waste hurled across the chamber.
This money could have built at least 25 new government schools.
This money was spent by the previous government. It's as simple as that.
As for the residents whose homes had been acquired to make way for the tunnel link,
Anyone who wants to come back to their home will be able to do so.
Leah Craven joins us. Leah, Daniel Andrews is trying to paint this as a win, but many disagree.
Well, as you just saw, Stephen, the opposition is furious. It says that there were hundreds of millions of dollars that was spent in the pre-tender process, and the government's not factoring that into the figure. We've also had some angry comments from Canberra. Tony Abbott says Victorians have a right to feel let down by Daniel Andrews. He's also said that it sets a dangerous precedent for future infrastructure projects in the state. But Daniel Andrews says Victoria will never find itself in a mess like this again. That's because he plans to legislate to clamp down on future governments who try to sign contracts at the 11th hour as an election is looming. He's also said the fact that his government persisted with negotiations as opposed to trying to legislate to wriggle out of its obligations means that Victoria's AAA credit rating is stable.
Thanks, Leah. Leah Craven at State Park.
Live from Melbourne, this is 7 News with Peter Mitchell.
Good evening. Victorian taxpayers are footing a bill of $420 million for the East-West Link to be dumped. The state government denies its compensation, describing it as money that's already been spent by the consortium. But the opposition says the funds could have been used to build 25 schools or buy 19 new trains.
The road to nowhere is no more. The East-West Link contracts have been cast aside and a new deal done.
This draws a line under this. We have fully delivered on the commitments we made, no compensation, none whatsoever. And the only monies that will be retained by the consortium are the monies that they have already spent.
The agreement spares the state the billion-dollar compensation payout that was promised when the Napthine government rushed to lock in contracts before the November election. But the burden on taxpayers is still $420 million. That includes $339 million to the East-West Link consortium and $81 million in bank fees. The opposition says that sum could have bought 19 trains or 28 trams, 25 new schools or a brand new iPad for every state school student. The figure doesn't include close to $500 million government departments have already wasted on planning and land acquisitions. It's all money down the drain, and in Parliament, each party blamed the other.
Nothing more than vandals.
Whoever's at fault, taxpayers are furious.
I think it's fairly pathetic, actually.
No, not good at all. Just seeing that being ripped up and the money going away is an absolute waste.
Had the toll road gone ahead, it's been revealed the true cost would have blown out to more than $10 billion. But the opposition says it would have been worth it, and the government's proposed rail projects are a poor substitute.
The government has ripped up a much-needed and vital piece of infrastructure for this city.
$3 billion in federal roads funding is now likely to be lost interstate.
This is a disastrous day for Victoria. It's a disastrous day for people looking for work in Melbourne.
Residents whose houses were acquired to build the road will now be able to go home. But it's too late for people like Mary Fenlon, who's had to move from her beloved Collingwood.
That's where my soul is. So I've lost my total sense of community.
So keen is the Premier to ensure there's never again a repeat of this costly saga. He says he'll introduce legislation to ban future governments from signing major contracts on the eve of an election.
Kate Jones, 7 News.
Good evening. Victorian taxpayers will have to pay $339 million for the East-West Link consortium to walk away from the controversial project. But the opposition says the cost of not building the road is much higher. State political reporter Andrew Lund.
The busy morning peak was only just winding down as the Premier and Treasurer announced the government had negotiated a deal with the East-West Link consortium to walk away from the controversial toll road.
There will be no compensation, none whatsoever, paid to the East-West Consortium.
The deal means the government will pay the consortium $339 million to cover its initial costs. It's also spent $81 million to establish a $3 billion credit facility the government now intends to use for the Metro Rail project.
Today's decision to reallocate the finance, the borrowings that were part of the East-West project into Melbourne Metro Rail means that we'll be able to deliver that project even more effectively.
The government released advice from Treasury showing the East-West Link would have cost much more than the headline figure of $6.8 billion, with a nominal cost of $10.7 billion over the 30 years of the contract, which was signed just weeks before last year's election and tabled in Parliament today.
What these documents are is the longest quasi-contractual suicide note in Victoria's history.
If, as you promised, that this contract was not worth the paper it was written on, why have you today paid over $420 million plus sunk costs as the price of your East-West Link deceit?
After threats by Labor to legislate its way out of paying compensation, today's negotiated outcome was welcomed by industry.
I think this is the least worst outcome that Victoria could have expected given the commitment to cancel the project.
Residents who'd been forced to leave their homes also welcomed this from the Premier.
Anyone who wants to come back to their home will be able to do so.
Music to the ears of Keith Fitzgerald.
Cheers. Well done.
Toasting the news with a beer by the bay and already planning the street party.
I hope to get my title back to my house very shortly and we'll get back to living just normally.
But in Sydney, Prime Minister Tony Abbott was less enthusiastic.
This is bad for Australia, but it's terrible for Victoria.
Both sides of politics are blaming each other for the huge waste of taxpayer funds. And with no major infrastructure currently on the books, pressure is now on the government to deliver in next month's state budget.
Andrew's in Collingwood tonight. Andrew, what does this mean for the future of infrastructure projects here in Victoria?
Well, Pete, ratings agency Standard & Poor's says Victoria's stable AAA credit rating has been unaffected by today's settlement. So that bodes well for potential future investment, but there could be other implications. The Victorian Auditor-General says he will now examine the East-West Link project as a matter of priority. And Labor says it's considering legislation that would stop future governments from signing such big contracts so close to elections. Pete?
Andrew Lund reporting.
The high cost of scrapping East-West Link. The state government agrees to reimburse the consortium $340 million. Good evening, Ian Henderson with ABC News. The Andrews government has signed a deal to resolve a bitter and protracted dispute over the dumped East-West Link project. The settlement will cost Victorian taxpayers more than $300 million. And the state's also taking on millions more in bank fees incurred by the consortium. And as Francis Bell reports, the opposition argues the real cost to taxpayers is more than double that amount.
A long-awaited resolution to a high-stakes dispute.
No compensation paid. Not $1.
But taxpayers are left with a hefty bill for a road that won't be built, with $339 million in project costs already incurred by the consortium, as well as $81 million in bank fees from the consortium's $3 billion loan. The government says it'll get value out of those fees because it's agreed to take over the loan and will negotiate with the banks to redirect it to the Melbourne Metro Rail project.
I'm not for a moment conceding that we won't drive a hard bargain.
They need to become clean as to the further costs they're putting onto Victorian taxpayers.
The Auditor-General is conducting an urgent probe into the entire project, and the political blame game is far from over. The opposition says today's figures don't account for state money already spent on project development and land acquisitions.
Making the real cost of this reckless political decision at least $800 to $900 million to the Victorian taxpayer.
Order. The Leader of the Opposition is wrong in his figures. He is wrong in his question.
The government argues building the road would have left taxpayers with 25 years of quarterly service payments to the consortium.
This is a $10.7 billion project.
The government's credit rating hasn't been affected by the project cancellation. The same can't be said for relations with the Abbott government.
In Victoria, the government is trashing the state's economic reputation.
He says he'll talk to the Premier about the possibility of redirecting $3 billion in federal funding. The government says it will move to prevent a repeat of the East-West Link saga by introducing legislation banning any future government from entering into major contracts just before an election. It's a move the opposition has described as a stunt. Francis Bell, ABC News, Melbourne.